So our third speaker is Joaquin Navajas.
Can you hear me? Can you see my presentation now? Yes? Okay, so thank you, Veronica. So my talk is going to be about crowdsourcing strategies to fact-check politicians and how social influence in diverse contexts may help. Let's start from a very simple thing we learned from the pandemic, which is that the spread of disinformation produces measurable changes in human beliefs and behavior, and may even pose tangible risks to human health. So, for example, in this bottom left corner, there is this story by this South Dakota nurse who on CNN told the reporter that she was seeing many patients that minutes before dying, they were still denying the existence of the very same virus that took us to that situation. So in many cases, these false beliefs and disinformation emerges spontaneously, and we don't know exactly who originated that. And but some other times it doesn't emerge spontaneously; it is intentionally spread by political leaders. So let me give you just one clear example. This one proceeds from Brazil. In Brazil, we know, and there is a paper, very nice paper by Nicholas Axelman and others, showing that objective metrics of social distancing decreased right after Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, inaccurately undermined the mortality of the virus. And this is time-locked to the moment in which Bolsonaro made those statements. So we know that political leaders spread disinformation, and so understanding how people judge the veracity of political speech has become a relevant issue in social and cognitive science. And so it is finding strategies that improve the accuracy of those beliefs. This is not just out of mere curiosity, but it also has like a kind of like a very practical application. Fact-checking agencies spend a lot of time and effort fact-checking the discourse of political figures. And so if lay people can improve their accuracy of those beliefs, they could, in principle, assist fact-checking agencies to fact-check the discourse of politicians. So imagine we could do that. That would be great. But and there is also kind of like relevant background research on how crowdsourcing, or actually asking for lay people to contribute or to help fact-checking agencies to classify misinformation, has been done recently in the past. So there are like three very good papers, at least in which they study how, for example, lay people's judgments are reliable indicators of the quality of pieces of news. There is another preprint by Resnick and colleagues showing that 16 lay judgments are as good as 3 qualified journalists. And there is also a paper published in Science Advances last year that's showing that crowds can predict fact-checkers' rating with approximately 80% accuracy. So one aspect of this relevant research in the past is that they basically essentially focus on one piece of misinformation or disinformation, which is fake news. But what happens with this other type of fake news, which is the discourse of political leaders, which also needs to be checked by fact-checking agencies, even spending much more time than the one they spend on checking headlines or fake news. So the main objectives, the main goals of this work is to first better understand how lay people make judgments about the veracity of phrases pronounced by political leaders, to measure the effect of social influence on the accuracy of those judgments after short interactions in either politically homogeneous or politically diverse settings, and third, to test the plausibility of extending these new developments on crowdsourcing approaches to fact-check now the speech of political leaders. So let me go through the rest of my talk on basically explaining the experimental design, the results of the at the individual level, the effects of social influence, and finally, let me tell you some results about the crowdsourcing results and conclusions. So going to the experimental design was based on 20 statements that we selected that were all pronounced by Argentinian politicians and that had previously been checked as either true or false by Chequeado. Chequeado is the main fact-checking agency in Argentina. So one example of this phrase would be, for example, Alberto Fernandez, the president of Argentina, saying that the state has provided financial assistance to 21 million Argentinians during the pandemic. And well, this is one example of the true statements. And this means that because we selected 20 statements and 5 were pronounced by a right-wing leader, 5 were pronounced by a left-wing leader, and half of them were true and half of them were false, these 20 statements were ensured that each participant would classify 10 statements from their supported party, which we will call a concordant statement, and 10 statements from the opposite party, what we would call a discordant statement, okay? So first, individuals would actually provide ratings of either whether they believe this was true or false, and confidence ratings for each of the 20 statements. Then in a second stage, this was an experiment run in Zoom during the pandemic. So they were exposed to social influence. They would speak to someone else for 1 minute per phrase and be able to be exposed to someone else having a different opinion on the judgment about the veracity of that of those phrases. Finally, in the third and last stage, people would provide revised individual judgments. And we organized social influence in an experimental design in the following way. We recruited a total of 180 participants, 90 of which were identified with the left-wing party in Argentina and 90 with the right-wing party in Argentina. And they were randomly assigned to either what we call a politically diverse setting and an heterogeneous dyad. So someone supporting the left-wing party and someone else supporting the left-wing, so left and right, an homogeneous dyad, which both would support the same party. And we had a third control condition in which participants would do a distractor task about answering general knowledge questions, such as the height of the Eiffel Tower during that time, and then provide revised judgment. So there was no social influence in the control condition. So when it comes to results, we observed that before social influence, participants were reasonably good. They were above chance at detecting actually they had above chance accuracy or performance before starting experiment, so before social influence. So on average, they would classify correctly 12 out of the 20 phrases. However, they were also biased to classify a statement as true if the statement was concordant, if it was pronounced by a political leader whom they supported, from the party they supported, right? So that was a strong effect for which there were like a plus of actually like 3 phrases that were additionally classified as true based on the ideology, on the concordance of the ideology of the participants. So what happens after social influence, which is the effect of this experiment that we designed, that we run? So essentially, after social influence, we observe a significant increase in accuracy and a significant reduction in bias. But interestingly, this was only present in the heterogeneous condition. So when people were discussing with someone supporting the opposite party, that increase in accuracy and that reduction in bias emerged. When there was an homogeneous interaction or a control or a placebo condition with no social interaction, there was no increase in accuracy, no change in bias at all. Finally, and regarding the potential use of these judgments to aid fact-checking agencies, we ran a crowdsourcing study. So we basically randomly selected a different number of individuals of politically balanced crowds from our sample, and we showed that politically balanced crowds can achieve 75% accuracy, so quite close to what have been published before. But that only happens after heterogeneous social influence. And in fact, we observed that homogeneous social influence decreases the accuracy of the crowd compared even to a control condition with no social influence. So wrapping up and quickly going to the conclusions, we found that lay people can classify the speech of political leaders with about chance performance. So people are reasonably good at identifying truth or false in the statements by the politicians that they support or that they are against. But they are subject, of course, to strong partisan biases. And social influence in politically diverse settings can partially neutralize their partisan bias. We do observe negative effects for homogeneous social influence in terms of the crowdsourcing performance of that. However, we believe that these results are promising regarding the potential usefulness of interactive crowdsourcing to fact-check politicians and potentially help fact-checking agencies reducing their workload and having these crowdsourcing strategies as a tool to assist them in their task to fight disinformation. So let me just finish by thanking the collaborators and other authors of this paper. There's a preprint coming soon with this story. And the first author is Santos Espina-Mayral, and I would also like to thank Florencia Bustos and Guillermo Solovey, who were also collaborators in this work. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Are there any questions in the room?
Thank you very much for very interesting research. I was wondering if your finding of the heterogeneity or diversity of political opinions amongst the people who are talking about these sorts of information, misinformation, can actually neutralize political biases. That, I think, is a very interesting finding. But I was wondering if the same thing happens, say, in a highly affectively polarized environment, like in the United States. I was wondering if, affective polarization basically means that you hate your political opponents, and you probably even avoid talking to them. And I was wondering if, first of all, if Argentina has the same level of affective polarization as in the United States, or not, and secondly, if the affective polarization increases so much that people hate to talk to each other, would that still hold?
Thank you very much for your question. So first of all, it is hard to answer the question about whether Argentina is more polarized or less polarized than the United States, because in order to especially talking about affective polarization, you would need to have the same instrument in both countries, in a representative sample of both countries, and draw some inference on the results of that survey. So we don't have that, but the closest we have is some unpublished research that we have in our group, where we asked, we do something similar to the thermometer scale on affective polarization in Argentina prior to the election of 2019, and we replicated something that is present in the United States, which is the fact that people show more greater hate for individuals from the other camp compared to the amount of love that they would show for people in their own camp. And essentially, this also explains the fact that there was a question that we had in that study where we asked, would you be willing to have an effective relationship with someone supporting the other party? And the most popular answer was no. So or there was negative ratings. So I would say that yes, the amount of polarization in Argentina is probably surpasses or even matches the amount of polarization that we see in the US. Of course, there is much more data in the US, and that's why we have the feeling that there is such a greater polarization there. But also one piece of data on how the last elections went. So we don't have a bi-party setting here. So there's more than two parties can present to an election, and spontaneously people were grouped into two support towards two political parties, and those two political parties got over 90% of the votes, even though there were third and fourth and fifth options to vote. So it is a very polarized context.
So I have a question from the chat. They're basically asking if you found any differences between parties. So are conservatives or liberals more prone to influence?
In this study, we added, so basically there's a regression I didn't include for a matter of time, but we actually checked essentially that. So if there was differential effects given by the left and the right, and we haven't. In this study, it's one of the. I mean, it's very symmetrical in that sense. So the effect is present both for the left and for the right, and there is no influence there. And in terms of, but it is again like a very different political setting than in the United States. Not in terms of the level of polarization, but in terms of the kind of like a political agenda endorsed from the left and from the right. The left in Argentina is completely different to the left in the US. And so is the right. For instance, there are known differences in terms of cognitive rigidity in the US that doesn't necessarily extend to other populations, and essentially also differences in there is research showing that some of the moral foundations that are more present in the right in the United States are not necessarily more present in Latin American countries. So essentially, this case it was quite symmetrical.
So we have one last question from the room.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great talk. I was wondering if you could comment on where you might see your results implemented in the political debate. So as you've shown that crowdsourcing can be a valuable source of validating political statements, how do you see this actually implemented into the real world, let's say?
Thank you. Wonderful question. So we are actively all the time collaborating with these main fact-checking agencies in Argentina. They help us identifying the right stimuli to run this, and they are interested in actually using this as an input to basically reduce the workload. In which sense? So essentially, imagine that you have consensus both from the left and the right that a given statement is true, even if it was pronounced by a politician in one of the two sides. So potentially, the amount of time that you could, as a fact-checking agency, dedicate to or spend in order to assess that statement could be lower from a statement which is more difficult. So basically, it could be an instrument to measure the difficulty of assessing the veracity of a statement as an input for fact-checking agencies. So that's where I see the applicability of this debate, because 80 or 75% is not good enough to actually automatically set a new have an automatic tool of classification, but it could help fact-checking agencies to speed up their own process.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much.